Hello everyone. Thank you all for watching the video. Wishing you all good health and peace. The village hummed under the soft veil of dawn, its rice fields glistening with dew, Tet's promise stirring in the air like a whispered vow. Diep stood in her modest garden, her hands deftly slicing bananas, their golden flesh a quiet hymn to hope, but her heart was a fragile thread, torn by a shadow she couldn't name. Hockey, her loyal dog, nuzzled her side, his warmth a balm to a soul that wavered between love and doubt. The phone in her pocket, a gift from James, was a beacon of dreams to learn, to rise, to become more than the orphan girl who'd once fled a broken past. Yet now it felt heavy, its screen a mirror to a heart caught in the storm of a man she loved and a truth she feared. Beyond the hills, the company crumbled, its vision of water and power for farmers shattered by a betrayal that cut deeper than steel. Diep's shack was a sanctuary, its patched walls warm with memory, its yard alive with the cluck of chickens and Hockey's playful bounds. She'd forged this life from nothing, orphan young, betrayed by an uncle who'd stolen her inheritance, married at 16 to a man whose fists left scars deeper than skin. She'd escaped, her name her only compass, and found James, his truck mired in mud, her shy laughter mingling with his as they pushed it free. "You're enough," he'd said, his voice steady, his eyes seeing her not as broken but as whole. She believed him, her heart opening to a man who called her scar stars, who gave her a phone to bridge a world she'd feared, letters she'd forgotten, a screen she fumbled. She tried, her tears falling in the quiet of night, her love for him a flame that flickered but never died. Now as she hung bananas to ripen, their sweetness a promise of Tet, she thought of James, of a company he fought to save, of farmers whose fields lay parched under a dam that stood silent. The Twin Sun hydroelectric project was a dream turned ghost, its steel skeleton a monument to trust shattered. James's company CI had poured 10 billion dong into it, a vow to bring water to thirsty fields, power to homes that flickered in the dark. It was meant to ease the farmers' toil, to give them days less heavy with sweat, nights less heavy with hunger. But John, the investor, had betrayed them, his wealth a blade, his heart a furnace of vengeance. He'd withdrawn his capital, bribed other shareholders to follow, and left the project a husk, its workers unpaid, its farmers facing starvation. James had told her, his voice low, his eyes sharp with a fire she hadn't seen before, and Diep's heart had torn, her fear a storm that swelled within her. John was no ordinary man. He was a smuggling lord from Thailand, his empire built on shadows, his rage rooted in a feud 35 years old, a wound tied to James's father, a truth buried in a past she couldn't reach. She'd heard James speak of it, his words heavy with a weight she couldn't lift. "John says my father ruined his family," he'd said, his voice a thread, his hands clutching papers that held a dangerous truth. He'd stood on a foggy hill, the village below a patchwork of hope and hardship, and spoken with Tuan, his confidant, his voice steady but torn. "I have evidence," he'd said, his fingers tracing videos, documents that could send John to prison. "But the farmers suffer. Their fields are dry, their children hungry." His heart wavered, caught between justice and mercy, between a man's hate and a village's need. Some shareholders had returned, their capital a fragile lifeline, and James planned to confront John, to demand he call back the funds, to spare the farmers more pain. "If he refuses," he'd said, his voice low, his eyes sharp, "I'll take him to court." His words were a gamble, a vow to hold a company cracking under betrayal, and Diep listened, her heart torn, her love a flame that burned despite the doubt that pulsed within her. Her garden was a hymn, its earth soft with promise, its leaves glistening with dawn's dew. She'd sown water spinach, her hands steady, her heart heavy with thoughts of James, of a future where they'd build a farm, a life woven from love and labor. Hockey scampered, his warmth a quiet balm, and she smiled, her tears falling, her dream a spark that glowed against the dark. The phone, its buttons a puzzle, was more than a gift. It was a vow to rise, to learn, to stand by him. She'd visited her mother, her heart torn between duty and desire, her hands offering cake and milk, their softness a vow to mend a bond strained by years apart. "Come live with me," her mother had said, her voice warm, her health restored after months of illness. But Diep had shaken her head, her shack her home, James her anchor. "I'll visit," she promised, her voice trembling, her heart heavy with a debt to James, to a farm that held her dreams. Her mother's eyes were kind, her words a plea, but Diep thought of James, of the phone he'd given, of a future where she'd sell goods online, her labor a spark that could light a path beyond the fields. James had come to her shack, his hands busy with rice, his laughter warm as the pot burned, the scent of charred grains mingling with Tet's promise. "I'm sorry," he'd said, his voice soft, his eyes bright with the truth he'd hidden too long. "John wrecked the company, but I've evidence now. The project's saved." She'd nodded, her heart torn but easing, her tears falling as he spoke. He'd sat with her, his hand steady, and taught her of phones, of online sales, of a future where she'd rise, not as a poor girl, but a woman who'd built a life from nothing. "You'll take orders," he'd said, his voice warm, "send goods through the post office, build a business that's yours." She'd listened, her heart racing, her hand still, his faith in her a vow that held her steady. "You're enough," he'd said, and she'd clung to it, her love a flame that burned, her doubt a whisper that lingered, a truth she feared to face. They'd eaten, the rice charred but sweet, their laughter a hymn to a love that endured despite the storms that loomed. But a shadow had fallen, its weight heavy as earth. Tieu, an elder with eyes sharp as blades, had come to her garden, his voice low, his words a wound. "Stay away from James," he'd said, his tone heavy with warning. His father fled Vietnam for a reason. Diep had faltered, her heart torn, her faith in James a flame that flickered under the weight of doubt. "He's good," she'd said, her voice trembling, her hands clutching Hockey's fur, but Tieu's words lingered, a pulse that echoed in the quiet of her shack. Was James's father tied to John's hate? Was their love built on secrets that could shatter her world? She'd stood, the bananas hanging like promises yet to ripen, and thought of James, of his laughter, of a love that felt true but trembled under truths unspoken. The company's office was a cage, its walls heavy with debt, its papers a map of trust broken. James had sat, his mind torn between John's shadow and Diep's light, and vowed to fight, to hold his world, to keep her safe. He'd thought of the farmers, their fields dry, their hands rough with hope, and smiled, his heart steady, his love a vow that held him still. The project was for them, for fields that thirsted, for a village that suffered, and he poured his heart into it, his wealth a vow to ease their pain. But John's betrayal had cracked it, his bribes a poison, his rage a fire that burned. The lawyer, Tieu, was John's pawn, bribed with 500 million dong to sabotage James's case, but James had evidence, videos, documents, a threat to pull, a truth to wield. John's laughter was a blade, his words a poison. "I'm the smuggling boss," he'd said, his face a mask, his rage a fire that burned. "Your father's sins are yours." James had stood, his heart heavy, his resolve aflame, knowing the truth, knowing the cost. He'd met John, his voice low, his eyes sharp. "Restore the funds," he'd said, "or face the law." John had sneered, his wealth a shield, but James had held firm, his evidence a sword that gleamed. "I underestimated you," John had said, his voice cold, his eyes sharp with a hate that burned. "This time I yield, but next time I won't." James had nodded, his heart racing, his plan a gamble that could cost everything, but his vow was clear, to save the farmers, to hold the dam, to keep Diep's light from fading. Diep's garden was a hymn, its leaves glistening with dew, its earth soft with promise. She'd sown seeds, her hand steady, her heart torn but held, and thought of James, of his promises, of a love that endured despite the pain. Hockey scampered, his warmth a bomb, and she smiled, her tears falling, her dream of a farm, a life with him, a spark that glowed. The phone, its buttons a puzzle, was a vow to rise, to learn, to stand by him, and she tried, her heart wide, her fear a shadow she pushed away. James had called, his voice a quiet strength, and she'd listened, her heart racing, her hand still. "You're enough," he'd said, and she clung to it, her love a flame that burned, her doubt a whisper that lingered, a truth she feared to face. Tieu was coming, its lanterns aglow against the dark, a promise of fortune she wanted to hold. Diep thought of James, his voice, his hands on her arm, his love a balm to her wound. He'd spoken of a farm, of fields heavy with grain, of a life they'd build, and she'd smiled, her heart wide as the hills. But Tieu's words, John's shadow, the farmer's hunger, were clouds over James's world. The phone in her hand, the rice she'd cooked, were steps toward a future she couldn't see, and the love she gave, to James, to Hockey, to her mother, was a choice she made each day. She thought of the bananas, their ripeness a promise, and of the farmers, their fields dry, their hope tied to a dam that stood silent, a dream betrayed by John's hand. James's resolve was aflame, his heart heavy with the weight of a village's need. He'd thought of the farmers, their children's hunger, their fields that cracked under the sun, and vowed to fight, to hold the dam that meant more than wealth, it meant life, for them, for Diep, for a village that cradled his heart. John's hate was a storm, his bribes a poison, but James had evidence, a truth to wield, a vow to save a dream that wasn't his alone. He planned a new office, a place where workers could meet, where ideas could bloom, where a company could rise from its ashes. But John's words, "Next time, I won't yield," were a blade, and James faltered, his heart racing, his plan a gamble that could cost everything. Diep stood in her shack, her hands busy with feed, her heart racing with James's vow. "I'll build for us," he'd said, his voice soft, his eyes sharp with resolve, and she'd nodded, her fear raw but easing, her love a hymn that held her still. The chickens clucked, their feathers bright, and she smiled, her dream of a farm, a life with James, a spark that warmed her shack. But Ken's warning lingered, a fire that burned, and she thought of the farmers, their hunger, their hope in a dam that stood silent, a dream betrayed by a man whose hate she couldn't fathom. She thought of her mother, of the cake she'd brought, of a bond she'd mend with visits, and of James, his laughter, his faith in her, a vow that held her steady. Questions lingered, soft as moonlight, heavy as earth. Would James unravel John's betrayal, or lose his world to a hate that burned? Would Diep's love, her heart torn by truths, hold strong, or would Ken's doubts, John's vengeance, pull them apart? She thought of the chickens, the field she'd worked, the love that held her heart close, and James's voice, "You're enough," a vow that warmed her shack. Would their dream endure, a seed in Tet's glow, or wither under storms too heavy? She didn't know, and the not knowing was a wound, faint but deep, that pulsed with every breath. Sleep would come later, broken by hockey's whines and the creak of the shack's walls. For now Diep stood by her garden, the moon high, the village quiet save for its endless hymn. She thought of James, of his fight, of a love forged in dust and pain. The answers weren't here, not yet. They lay beyond the hills in a dawn she couldn't see, and as she turned back to the shack, her step steady, her soul burned, a flame that trembled but didn't die.